This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this episode of the podcast. This episode is brought to you by the UK team behind the artisan Beta Cut pruning products. Still largely undiscovered by the UK market, they've recently been discovered by Selfridges in May of this year, and they're now stocked there. The Beta Cut brand is a sign of excellent craftsmanship using traditional hot drop forging methods with the handmade cutting tools made in Erba, Italy, near the banks of Lake Como. Beta Cut has been a leader in providing steel cutting blades since 1955 and offers gardeners handcrafted products for those seeking that unique and traditional alternative. They're good as a gift too. See the pruner and sharpening stone box set in the link in the show notes. As a special offer for listeners, Beta Cut is offering a special 20% off all orders placed via the website throughout August 2021. Simply visit the link in the show notes and enter the code ROOTS20, all uppercase, at the checkout. This week's guest is Annika Zetterman, a Swedish garden designer, teacher and author of New Nordic Gardens. Annika works internationally, designing visually beautiful gardens which encompass sustainability, respect for the local environment and aesthetic, and which exemplify all the best aspects of Scandinavian design. In this episode, Annika talks about the ethos behind Scandinavian design, as it's expressed in a landscape setting, and decodes why the gardens featured in her book are so downright stunning. First up, she explains which countries are included in the Nordics.
Well, when it comes to the Nordic Gardens, there are 5 countries, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway and Sweden. And the term Scandinavia is commonly used for Denmark, Norway and Sweden. But however, from a design perspective, the term, despite Nordic or Scandinavian, is often referred to as Scandinavian design.
Okay. Yes, it does. Perfectly. You cover lots of different aspects in the book that kind of define Scandinavian design and what you can expect to see in gardens from those regions. And I thought it was really interesting because as I was looking through the photographs in the book, which are beautiful, the word clean kept coming to my mind. And I think there's kind of numerous phrases associated with Nordic design. So things like pared back and uncluttered and clean. And I thought, without exception, that the gardens that you cover are exactly that. So I thought maybe you could talk about where you think that aesthetic comes from. You know, is it so ingrained in the culture that it's expressed in all aspects of the design work? Because it certainly seems like it.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. In my view, when talking about new Nordic gardens or Nordic gardens as we kind of create them today, is that there is always a strong connection to 2 things. It's to both our landscapes and the nature, and the second thing is our design heritage. And these 2 combined sort of makes us create these clean expressions. So if I just basically talk a little bit about the nature as such and how it's related to our gardens today, is that the nature in Scandinavia is often bare. It's dramatic rock formations, often large open plains with wildlife, meadows or grasses. And there's loads of birch trees, pines and spurs, depending on where you are in the region. Now, these landscapes are far less lush and smooth and green as, you know, your English rolling hills, so to speak. So the expression in the landscape is rather harsh and rather bare itself. And this has obviously an impact on how gardens and the design carried out will kind of marry these landscapes. And Scandinavians, we are nations that have always cared for nature. I mean, basically, we kind of live with nature and very close to nature. So in gardens, we don't really frame away or dictate nature as such, but we sometimes invited to the gardens. So another aspect is that we do have a lot of land, and gardens are on average quite big. So they could naturally contain a part of a wilderness or forest or meadows. And depending on, again, where you are, it might even be rock beds in your garden, which is not unusual in mid-Sweden and towards the some of the coastal areas in Norway, obviously, with their rock formations. Many times nature is an asset to be incorporated into the design. So we really try to make them one unit rather than separate nature and gardens. Now, obviously, this can be challenging from a design perspective. Many times it is. And this also means that keeping things clean sometimes is the best way forward. And also in connection to architecture, which is sort of from a design perspective very clean. So nature is one thing. And when it comes to sort of cleanness, I think another thing to add to the geographical kind of vastness that we live in is that we do have sort of big, great openness around gardens. And this sort of emptiness is also, I think, a reflection on these clean palettes and clean expressions that we often create. So they do become something positive in the garden rather than thinking, oh, we need to dress and frame and decorate things, which is not really adding to gardens and our landscape. Now, in terms of the design perspective, Scandinavian design is, as many probably know, a very renowned sort of phrase worldwide. And the origin from the design, well, the Scandinavian design, it origins from a movement in creative production, which happened, it peaked in the 1950s, but it's actually spanned from the 30th until the 1970s. And it's also a period called the Golden Age in the Nordics. And this movement happened in all 5 countries at more or less the same time. And it's not just within the design sort of movement, but that's a very, very strong genre. And it's based on work carried out with a high level of attention to functionality and quality, and with philosophies of modesty and equality. And during this period, domestic design products were that they really achieved the sort of international popularity and went under the sort of branding of Scandinavian design. So you probably heard of loads of historic icons and designers and architects such as Arne Jacobsen, Alvar Aalto, Hans Wegner, etc., etc. So these sort of still are. It is a period in Scandinavia that's still setting the bar and what we work from. And I also want to mention the sort of rebirth, so to speak, of Scandinavian design as a new Nordic design, which is another phrase that's more and more commonly used, and it can be used in what's the word? Like the food industry, Sarah?
Cuisine? Gastronomy, yeah.
Gastronomy, yeah. So it can be used in gastronomy or in garden design or sort of interior design, fashion design. So this sort of new Nordic concept is a spin-off, also looking back at this mid-century modern design, but obviously now at a later time. So this new, sort of quote new, often appears today and is referring to a new chapter in Scandinavian design, but with the consistency of pride and heritage of designers and architects from the golden age and the values established then.
Fascinating. I just wanted to pick up on one thing that you said about the kind of near the beginning about the fact that quite often you have to deal with natural elements like rocks, for example, occurring in a garden. And I wondered if that made you kind of not afraid to tackle hard landscaping in a bold way, because what I got from reading the book was that a lot of consideration is given to material choice, a lot of clarity is used, and things are pared down so that you can, you might pick one or two key materials and then use those in a really sort of strong way. I wondered if that particular selection of hard landscaping materials does seem to be an intrinsic part of the design process. Maybe, perhaps you could just sum up what you think the Nordic approach is to hard elements in a garden.
Yeah. Well, I want to start with saying that in today's garden, I always have this in mind, and I think a lot of designers do working outdoors, is that we marry functionality and sustainability with grace. That's sort of the fundamental concept of Scandinavian and a Scandinavian approach. And then we always have to bear in mind that things created in the Nordics, and especially in the outdoors, they have to last. And this is obviously hasn't changed despite of when in history we talk. So great gardens in the Nordics, they do require very skilled craftsmanship, and the concept of simplicity. I also want to mention that it involves the most precise and accurate solutions, and not compromising on execution or materials or making shortcuts, because again, that would not last in Scandinavia. So therefore, the materials that you choose, and it doesn't really matter whether we talk about hard landscaping or soft landscaping, but it really has to be thought through and worked out thoroughly. Going back to your question about the sometimes very, very difficult sites of numerous elevations, rock beds, and so on, it is a challenge, and sometimes a very, very big challenge. And it requires, obviously, knowledge from the designer and the contractor as well. But you are selective to what you do and where you do things in the garden. And obviously, again, with respect to the nature and trying to make the most out of things. So yes, it is certainly a lot of aspects to be involved. The seasons, the weather, the harsh winters, and the warm summers.
Yeah, I thought that that was a later question of mine now, but actually it's a good time to mention it. When you referenced the weather in the book, you wrote, when working with gardens in Scandinavia, we live between hope and despair and constantly look to what is to come. That's a really interesting thing to say. And I noticed as well, you write about the really distinct seasons. How does that become expressed in the gardens and the way they're designed?
Well, it is expressed in a very, very wide sense. For one, planning is key. I would say that without planning in Scandinavia, you're due to fail, basically. We have very short spans compared to other countries further south in terms of execution of work. So the planning phase is crucial. And it's also an environment where the seasons are very, very unpredictable. So it's sort of when I say, working and living between hope and despair, it's always an uncertainty in whatever you do, whatever you plant. There is a risk for every year, because we pretty much don't know how hard the winter is going to be, how hot the summer is going to be, and so on. So in comparison to, again, countries in further southern Europe, or even in the UK, for instance, I can mention pruning. And I remember living in the UK, and it was basically sort of holding some plants back because they easily overgrow or, become too large. Whereas here is the opposite. So a lot of times you're actually happy if a plant becomes, a bigger size or big enough that you wish it to be. So it's the survival is not taken for granted, and gardens really have to be both carried out and maintained with persistency and care, because otherwise they will not, develop and thrive as you wish them to.
The other thing that is an element of the weather is that you talk about the importance of light in Nordic gardens in your book. And I was really interested in the daylight, which you describe as white in the summertime. And I wondered how, I don't know whether you can speak to this, but, how this might differ from the light somewhere like the UK or the Mediterranean. And again, what effect does that have on the colours and the materials that designers choose? Yeah.
I mean, for one, light and seasons, they really go hand in hand in Scandinavia, and they do have a major impact on gardens. They do, with the light, it obviously changes the character of a garden. And light is one of the most challenging, but also it can be the most rewarding aspect. And now I'm talking about sort of the natural light in Scandinavia, which really can make, if you plan a garden in a great way, it can make a garden mesmerizing. It can make dramatic sort of expressions. But it also, with the seasons and the weaker light in autumn, creates these really, really fragile expressions. So the strong light, the light is extremely strong in summer, when the sun is very high up and we have the light sort of flooding 24/7. And it's also a time, and it's actually now sort of when it's peaking around midsummer and beginning of July, when everything is alive. Everything is alive. Basically, you hear birds singing at midnight, and you see wildlife and bees and butterflies sort of working as much as they can. All day and all night, and it's something really, really, unique with that. Now, with the softer light in autumn, obviously the angle is much lower, so you do get, when we talk about plants, it's also an effect of the plants to be more visible, and in particular, quite weak colors. They come out well, and small flower heads is also very visible. So it's not a need, and it's a reason why also the wildness and the landscapes in Scandinavia, you see a lot of the small plants and small grasses rather than the bold, exotic, wide leaf plants and other trees and shrubs that you do in the Mediterranean or in the UK or anywhere else exotic. So this way of working with light and plants and color is a very, very important one. Another aspect that I would like to mention is that due to the light being very strong in summer, it's important to be careful not to work with hard landscaping that it's too light, because it sort of creates this almost like a blindness to your eyes, as if it would be snow in this sort of brightness. And that's the reason I think it's always wise to, whatever you do in your local area, despite where you are, is to look around, like what rocks are naturally in your own environment, what can be found there in terms of plants as well, because you are highly likely to success in your garden if you do follow the regional sort of natural stone and rock bed. So, for instance, in Scandinavia, it would be slate, it would be granite, and it would be limestone, and different sort of silvery colors mainly, rather than too bright or too dark.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, and that does, I think, apply in the UK as well. Sometimes with white paving, it can be unbearable to kind of look at in the sunshine.
Yeah,
I thought it was interesting what you said about sustainability, because you need to check that things are built to last and to cope with the environment and the climate. I think in your book, I get the impression that sustainability underlies outdoor design in Nordic countries. Is it just because of the fact that you need to build things to last and be resilient, or is there another reason why that's historically been the case and seems to continue today?
But I think when it comes to sustainability, it's also something fundamental in the Scandinavian ethos, really. Back in the day, historically, we lived in this region to survive. I mean, survival was the only thing, and so there was no room for the things that were not necessary. So everything you did, obviously, you used materials that were local. As one example, also, which is very common today and quite a trendy thing, I would say, and hopefully here to stay, is Sedum Roofs and these sort of green roofs that are added onto cities and likewise in private gardens on garages or small houses and so forth. This is not something new. This is something that's been in our history for years and years, looking back. But it's a revival in a sense, and it's a very sensible way of working with the environmental aspects and looking at what can be done in a sensible way to your garden. So I think the to answer this sort of sustainability aspects and another thing in Scandinavia is that again, gardens are being quite large, and it gives you opportunity to, for instance, grow your own food. And that's also something that's been done for years and years and years. And back in the day, that was the only thing that you grew. You didn't think about ornamental plants, but it was only about surviving winter and having apple trees and so forth to produce produce that you could use, and that's something again that's coming back, and people have the appreciation of being self-sustainable or almost self-sustainable.
Yeah, I like the fact that your design has this kind of historical thread and cultural thread running through it. Are there any other trends that are emerging in new Nordic gardens?
Yes, I would say, in general, I'm happy to say that the interest in gardening and in garden design, and actually to take care of your garden, that has grown in general. And there is a big, well, I should say that, a lot of people, they're actually either moving to the countryside, or people are buying allotments or summer houses or cottages. So the space, the actual garden and outdoor space, is valued quite high among people today. And it has that sort of personal value, and people want to really make sure that they use the gardens and use it wisely and see it as an asset to a house. I mean, if growing used to be big, it's even bigger now. I think there is also, with the restrictions that's been going on for quite some time now, that there is currently a longing for the exotics, and for traveling and also the escape from perhaps work and so on. And so the desire then for outdoor swimming pools and lounging close to water has certainly been something that's been on the rise. And also orangeries and greenhouses to kind of prolong the seasons and use the garden more widely. It's certainly a boom of that. So basically, I think that Scandinavian gardens have rapidly changed over the past few years, and often larger proportions of gardens are arranged these days, and in a much greater degree than they used to be. And gardens are much more. I mean, it's much more than an extension of a home, but they're actually spaces which people like to use to the maximum potential, and where we really like to spend a lot of time. So another aspect is that Scandinavians are very open-minded and not afraid of trying new ideas in general. And so gardens today, I think they serve a multi-functions, and they're really there to prolong the seasons. We talked a bit about the seasons, and that's another aspect that I think might be different from Scandinavia compared to the rest of Southern Europe, is that we really, really want to make the most out of the seasons and use the gardens not just in summer, but throughout, autumn as much as possible, early spring, and even in winter time. So therefore, you see a lot more added to the gardens. You see things like outdoor kitchen and pizza ovens, saunas and kitchens that didn't used to be in the same extent before. And it's due to also that Scandinavians, we really move outdoors in summertime. We're not just using the garden and sit there sort of randomly, but it's actually families that they spend the entire day out in the garden if the weather is nice, and it's happening throughout the whole summer.
A very big thank you to Annika for talking about Nordic Gardens. If you appreciate design and beautiful gardens, you should definitely pick up a copy of her book. Thank you to you for listening, and to Beta Cut for sponsoring this episode. Now here's Dr. Ian Bedford talking about a bug that is usually heard and not seen.
Walking through a grassy meadow on a warm, sunny summer's day, and we'll almost certainly hear the chirping of grasshoppers. However, living amongst the grass and extremely well camouflaged, we're less likely to see them, until they suddenly leap up in front of us to avoid getting squashed. In Britain, we have 11 species of grasshoppers, and these differ in a number of ways from their near relatives, the crickets. Primarily, grasshoppers are herbivores and are active during the day, whilst crickets are omnivores and mainly nocturnal. They also differ in the way that they make their chirps, with grasshoppers rubbing their hind legs against their forewings and crickets just rubbing their forewings together. Chirping, which is known as stridulation, works in a similar way to us running our fingernails along a comb, and it's used by grasshoppers and crickets to attract a mate. Each species of these fascinating insects has its own unique chirping sound, which ensures they're able to attract a mate from the right species. Amazingly, grasshoppers have tiny but highly evolved ears, not only to recognise the different chirps, but to tell the directions they are coming from. Ears that are not too dissimilar to ours, using eardrums that vibrate at different frequencies. Their ears, however, are not located on their heads, but are on the sides of their abdomen, and are such incredibly effective organs that they are now being studied by scientists to help us develop smaller and more effective hearing aids. Once the grasshoppers have successfully located their partners and mated, the females will begin laying their eggs into the soil. Then, as winter approaches, the adults all die. Their eggs, safely underground, will then overwinter until the following spring, when they hatch into nymphs that feed on lush new grass leaves, growing and molting a few times before they become adults and are ready to begin yet another season of summer chirping.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.